Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Behind the Headlines. We are going to jump to our next topic now, which brings us still to the UK. It seems as if the Brexit campaign is continuing as the UK prepares and debates whether or not we should be staying in the European Union or not. But it seems as if the government has now decided that they would like to spend taxpayers' money to promote their side of the argument, which has seen a petition launched against this use of the taxpayers' money, which has reached over 100,000 signatures and is growing. In fact, the last time I saw it today, it was at least 140,000, give or take, and I'm sure it's rise more since. I believe we have a VT to give us a bit more information, so let's play that now.
It is, I think, one of the most important political decisions that you will take in your lifetime. When we have a general election, we vote in a government, and if we don't like that government, 5 years later we can vote them out again. That's obviously not a bit that I like about life, but nonetheless that's the way it works. With this referendum about whether we stay in or whether we leave a reformed European Union, it's a vote and a decision that we will be living with probably for the rest of our lifetime. So it's absolutely vital we really think hard about all of the issues and we make a clear and sensible decision. And so I make no apology for the fact that we have, we are sending to every household in the country this leaflet which sets out what the government's view is and why we come to that view. We're not neutral in this. We think it would be a bad decision to leave. We think it would be bad for our economy, bad for jobs, bad for investment, bad for families' finances. We think it would be bad for universities. We're not neutral. So we've made a clear stance in this leaflet, which I hope everyone will get a copy of at their home. Because I think in many ways you have the most to gain by staying in a reformed European Union, and you also have the most to lose if we leave the European Union. But I'm afraid to say, as things stand, you're the least likely people to vote. That's what's happened in past general elections. So my plea is, really have a look at this and do decide to vote on June the 20th.
Well, there you have it. The EU referendum is approaching fast, and we're starting to see now an increase in activity, political activity, from all of the political leadership on both sides of the argument. Let me jump straight to you, Clive, bring you in on this. Now, obviously, this is a hot topic. No one's quite sure where it's going to go. Polls are all over the place at this stage. We're not quite sure where it's going to lie. A lot of the UK public has said that they want information about this. They're not quite sure. They don't know where they stand. They want info, which is fair enough. The government has said that the European Union allows legally for them to spend taxpayers' money to educate their side of the argument, and the government's argument is they want to stay in the EU. And then obviously the opposition, the out team, has complained about this and has tried to, cause a fuss. Taxpayers' money shouldn't be spent on one side of the argument and so on. What do you make of all this? Is this a fair way to do it, or is it biased? What do you make of it?
Well, I think if one's only putting... Sure, the government has a duty to educate the public. That is not controversial. But if they're only putting one side of the argument, in other words, if they're only putting the rationale for staying in, rather than giving a fair and balanced picture as to what is actually a finely balanced argument to some people, to other people it's a very clear-cut argument one way or the other. But unless they're putting that all that information, it's a clear abuse of public funds. But I think in order for people to understand EU, there are a lot of reasons that can be put forward as to why the EU has been a good thing. It's given us the European Court of Human Rights. It's improved a great many aspects of life today. And one could argue that it's been a tempering force on the more authoritarian tendencies of government. The problem is that now the EU is as authoritarian or more authoritarian than national governments, and it is becoming increasingly less democratic. And to understand the EU, you need to understand its origins, that actually it dates back to post the Second World War. The CIA were closely involved. It was an American idea to create this an Anglo-American idea to create a United States of Europe, to reduce remember that we'd already broken Germany by that stage. So in order to ensure that European powers would never be a threat to the Anglo-American empire ever again, the EU was the answer. And you can follow its development through Bilderberg. The first Bilderberg meeting was in 1954. There was a rather shadowy character called Joseph Rettinger, who was a main proponent of the EU. And it's a stepping stone to the one world government. We're back to what we were talking about earlier. The more you can build conglomerates of territory under one government, then actually knitting them together into a global government gets that much easier. So the EU is a stepping stone to a one world government. What isn't told by this government or people in favour of staying in is that the likelihood is that if we stay in the EU, every European country within the EU will have to adopt the euro ultimately. That means a single government again. It's all about centralising power. And those are the arguments that aren't being put forward. And when it comes to Brexit, which seems to be the handle for voting to come out, it's blatant scaremongering. They come out with figures that are clutched out of the air saying it's going to cost X or each family will lose Y, and it's absolute nonsense. There is no empirical basis to any of the claims that are made. I would say that the financial argument is probably fairly neutral when it comes down to it. I'm sure that, I haven't studied it in depth, but the far bigger issue in my mind is, are we happy with moving towards a one world government or are we not? And increasingly, Europe is an authoritarian body that rides roughshod over all our lives.
Fascinating. Moeem, let me bring you in on this. Let me ask you on a personal level, what side of the debate are you on? Are you an in EU or are you an out of EU? And perhaps you could explain why.
Well, yeah, very simply, I'm an outer, if that's the
out
yeah,
team,
out.
Yes, out
And
EU.
why? Very simply, I believe in Europe. I believe, this continent was devastated with a civil war. I can understand the logic, let's get together, let's work together, let's be together, la-di-la, that rhetoric. However, I agree with Clive. Basically the bottom line is, and we've all got to conceptualise the issue very clearly, do we believe in national sovereignty or not? It's a very complex issue, actually. For instance, where I come from, north of the border, we've got a weird situation. The SNP, who are nationalists, actually want to, is my understanding, they want to get into Europe, yeah? Whereas in England, there's quite a divided situation, polarisation. But yeah, my argument is very simple. I'm in favour of a vote for Britain to have its self-determination and a future outside the EU. So in terms of this this leaflet, I'm against one side having access to more resources and by definition abusing, if it's the government side, their power. That is an unfair, it's an unfair vote.
Do you think that the UK could survive outside of the EU?
Yes, I do.
Do you believe that that's a believable scenario?
Well, that's like asking the Scots. That's like asking the Scots, can you survive outside the UK? Look at Norway. Look at Norway.
That as well.
Look at Norway.
Question as well, which I was actually going to bring to you. Actually,
yeah. Some of these questions are very simple to answer. It's just the propaganda machine, yes, which blurs the picture.
But if the UK was to leave, then you have already mentioned that there is the question about Scotland remaining in the UK. Do you see that if we did decide to leave, that would be very hypocritical of the out arguments that they want us to leave the EU, but then all of a sudden they'll turn around perhaps and go, well, we don't want Scotland to leave, we're one island and so on. So it seems as if there's a bit of hypocrisy there in that.
Well, this is very interesting. I spoke on the elections last year. I said it's up to people's conscience who they want to vote for. But I think I did also raise this question about the constitution of the United Kingdom. There's no doubt about it, whichever way it goes, you know, democratic will of the people. I think after it, even now actually, there's a brewing constitutional crisis in this country. You know, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and indeed London and the English regions, you know, devolution of power. So I think regardless of Brexit or non-Brexit, we have also got an underlying issue in our country, indeed all countries, about power and decentralisation of power. So perhaps that is a bigger issue. Yeah.
Clive, let me come back to you now. Now, Jeremy Corbyn is one individual who has suggested that the EU is not perfect, there are a lot of problems, but the only way we can tackle these problems and deal with them is to be in the EU. You know, just turning your back on it and walking out, storming out of the meeting, however you want to put it, is no way to deal with any issue. It's childish, in fact, if you put it in that sense. What do you make of his viewpoint on the issue?
Well, he's characterising the EU as an institution in a way that it doesn't actually operate. Because if it was a question, if I felt that we lived in a proper democracy in the UK and our government really represented the views of the people, which it doesn't because obviously only 26% voted for the current government. But let's just suppose that our government is the legitimate representation of us, then arguably that democratic mandate should be delivered into Europe and should be discussed in the context of Europe between governments. And a certain number of decisions do get made that way. But the vast majority of legislation and regulation which comes out of Europe has nothing to do with national governments. It's coming from the Commission. If you take trade agreements, because trade agreements are very much another stepping stone to a one-world government. You've got these big trade agreements like TTIP with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Now that is seeking to homogenise regulation between the US and the UK. Now that is being driven by corporate secondees to the European Commission. The European Commission is not an elected body, it's an appointed body. So we're being run by a technocracy, which is nothing like what Jeremy Corbyn is suggesting. He's suggesting that if we want to be in the club, we ought to go and discuss in the club and get what we want out of the club. That's not the way the club works. The club has a mechanism, a technocracy, which is driving this European project forward inexorably. And at the margins, national governments get to tinker, but they're all under the same control. They're all being controlled by the same forces, effectively. And our analysis at Critical Thinking has come down to this structural elite that basically decides who gets into power because they control the media, and how that power is exercised. They control it. They control all the levers of power. So the EU is another lever of power. Whoever has the Trade Commission is a vital person, as is the chairman of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi. Who's he? He's another Goldman Sachs alumni, another member of the banking fraternity. This is a banking cartel that is running the world, and the EU is just a subset of that. So Jeremy Corbyn's analogy doesn't actually wash in the real world. And he doesn't probably, I don't think he understands that. Because if he understood that, he wouldn't say such things.
Sure. Moim, let me come back to you. Now, I'm interested to get a bit more information because obviously we've seen a lot of criticism about the out camp from the government and so on. The government has made very clear, David Cameron's government has made very clear that it wants to stay in, and this is why we're seeing them choosing to spend taxpayers' money on their side of the campaign. But they've raised a lot of issues which are very genuine. Issues, for example, like the threat of terrorism, how they receive information from fellow governments in the European Union, which share information and so on. And this is obviously a big issue which affects society these days. It's a big concern for many. Do you think that if the UK did leave Europe, that you might just see the rest of Europe kind of you know, kind of in a kind of tongue-in-cheek style, just completely cut UK off. If you're not going to play a game with us, then we're just going to not play a game with you. And we could see issues like this, information sharing, put the UK at risk. Would you not agree with that?
On the surface, you know, you could say there's some merit to it. However, no. I mean, there's fear-mongering going on. I mean, there are, perhaps this is, since the post-war situation, perhaps the biggest decision this country's got to make. There's a lot of vested interests. Indeed, I wouldn't say terror is the big issue, especially if you believe there's a thing called false flag terror. That's another issue. But in terms of jobs, you know, which might be used, impact on jobs, employment, there may be some temporary, no doubt, adjustments. But I think long-term, Britain, especially its history, its connections, trade, financial, economic relationships, can survive and thrive. I'm certainly, I mean, come on, Britain didn't knock the door off the Germans and French and Spanish to have the British Empire, did it? So of course it can survive. And so no, that's rubbish. There's a lot of fear-mongering going on, full stop.
Well, very interesting points raised. I do want to move on to the next topic now, if you don't mind, gentlemen. I do think it's an important topic which we should get into the show and dedicate plenty of time to. And it is the new new facts that have come out from the UN have been revealed that it seems as if the Israeli Israeli government has not only been continuing its policy of demolishing and replacing Arab homes in the West Bank and so on, but it's actually been increasing their activity and speeding up this displacement of and building of illegal settlements in Palestinian territories. We actually have a video which will bring us all up to speed on exactly what's been going on there.
في 2016 في 9/2 اجوا الساعة 8 صباحا هدموا ل6 مزارعين، وبعدها في 2/3 هدموا ل 13 مزارع بما فيه المدرسة، وبعدها في 23/3 هدموا ل 20 مزارع وبركة المي. طبعا الناس لما بيشوفوا الجيش اجى من الشارع من غاد بصيروا ينادوا على بعضهم هيهم اجوا وبتحضروا حالكم، وبصيروا يتحضروا ونقلوا اغراضهم بصير فزع، يعني فزع ورعب. علم الاتحاد الاوروبي ردين على الاتحاد الاوروبي ولا ردين ولا على اوباما نفسه اللي اكبر من الاتحاد الاوروبي.
شايف كلها بركسات وخيام وما فيش فيها، يعني ممنوع البنايه فيها، يعني لو بدهم يبنوا مدرسه بيردوا يهدوها. عشان هيك استخدمنا هاي البنايه، وهي بنايه قديمه جدا وتفتقر الى مقومات الحياه الاساسيه، لا كهرباء لا مي لا حمامات ولا اي شيء فيها ممكن الطالب يستفيد منها او المدرس حتى.
احنا كنا بالمدرسه بس ساعتها اجوا اليهود قاعدين بيهدوا بالبيت اللي جبنا. احنا صرنا نبكي وكان الاستاذ تركونا ما تخافوش هذول بيعملوا لناش اشي. كان في جندي صورنا وصور معنا القارمة بتاعت المدرسة كلها وصور كمان من جوا. هسه بعد اسبوع سمعنا انها مهدومة مدرستنا. يوم جينا ما ضلش في انا عقل، يوم هيك شفت المدرسة قلت هاي مستحيل تبقى مدرستنا، يعني هيك سووا لنا اياها بكت احلى منها ما مدرسه ما في. انا ما صدقتش انهم هيك يزبطوا لنا اياها البلديه وهيك اليهود هدموا لنا اياها. واحد 129 129 احد اشرار
Well, there you have it, some upsetting footage from what's going on in Palestine. Just before I go back to the guests, there was some information I quickly jotted down which I might share about the figures that we've seen from the reports coming out about this issue. The UN offices, which are based in and working in Gaza and the West Bank, have revealed that they've seen a huge spike in the amount of demolitions of Arab homes in the West Bank and Palestinian territories. It's jumped from an average of about 50 demolitions a month between 2012 to 2015, and it's jumped to an average of around 200 and over 100. It seems it's jumped. So from an average of 50 a month, it's jumped this year to over 100 demolitions, 165 since January on average. February alone, we have seen 235 demolitions, which is a huge increase to the 50 average that we saw in previous years. Clive, let me jump straight to you. We've got about 5 minutes till the break, which is enough time, I think, to get your opinion on the subject. Why do you think we're seeing this escalation? I mean, what's going on here? I mean, surely we should be seeing a gradual lead to peace. I mean, why is it escalating? What's going on?
Well, I mean, this ties in some senses with the Panama Papers. And when one recognises that this structural elite that we've identified have a number of levers of power, there seems to be a symbiotic relationship between the structural elite and Israel. That is very much a lever of power in the Middle East, as we've seen in terms of its effect all around the region. I mean, it is... I feel a loss for words to describe the sense of outrage that this goes on, and the BBC, all the main news channels totally ignore that it is getting worse. It is not getting better. This has been a constant land grab since 1948. It's been progressive, it's been unstoppable, and it seems that if you reckon that 80% of Conservative MPs are in the Friends of Israel, there's a large proportion of Labour MPs, Friends of Israel, Liberal the same. They're heavily... Washington is deeply in the pockets of Israel. Senators and congressmen go over to Israel on trips. So one is only getting one side of the story. I heard yesterday on Radio 4 an article about something Piers Corbyn said that Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't disassociate himself with because it was anti-Semitic. I mean, this is nonsense to be discussing such puerile diversions when there's real tragedies, real deaths, real people being oppressed day after day. It's a concentration camp in the middle of the Middle East that the West seems to be totally impervious to any news. The news that comes out of there, when we had the war, they call it a war. It wasn't a war. It was a massacre going on in 2009-10. There was outrage because they couldn't hide it. But this is... Ever since all that's been going on with Syria and all over the rest of the world, and the Panama Papers being a case in point, is obscuring what's really going on in Israel. And they have continuously grabbed more and more land. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier about dispossessing people from the land is the primary problem. It's not about income tax, it's dispossessing people from land. If you dispossess them from land, basically you remove their means to life, and there's no greater sanction than removing somebody's means to life. So I find myself at a loss as to understand how we in this country and in the West can tolerate this situation when fellow humans are suffering in this way.
It does remind me very much of Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, who visited Israel not too long ago. I think it was last year, give or take. I'm not too sure of the time frame. It was recent enough for me to remember. And he seemed to be cozying up to the Israeli government, but which is fair enough, but at the same time he seemed to be criticising in a number of comments he made in an interview against the Palestinian and pro-Palestine activists in a very biased fashion. You know, it's one thing to be friendly with Israel, that's you know, everyone has the right to do that, but to be biased in that sense and to be aggressive against the Palestinians when we have these figures coming out of Gaza and whatnot seems to be very peculiar indeed. We are coming to a break. I will bring Moim in after the break to give him plenty of time to share his views. So stick around, as I'm sure you will all be interested as I am to hear what Moim has to say.
It is outrageous.